Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. The stars above the ruined battlefield were quiet. They shimmered gently, cold and distant, as if they hadn't noticed what had just happened below. Giant alien warships, once beautiful and terrifying, now floated in broken pieces, slowly spinning in the dark. Some still burned, leaving long trails of fire behind them. Others were split open like crushed eggs, their shining armor ripped apart by blasts that shouldn't have been possible. Admiral Korthax stood inside the remains of his command ship, his hands still trembling, not from fear, not anymore. Fear had come and gone long ago. Now, all that remained was something deeper. A cold, heavy silence that not even the hum of damaged machines could break. His armor was scratched and stained, the colors of his rank dulled with soot and dried blood. None of it was his. It belonged to his crew, his friends, his warriors, all gone. Through the cracked window ahead, something moved. A shape, small, rough, and strange, not sleek like their ships, not glowing with power. It looked old, ugly, human. The Admiral narrowed his eyes as it floated silently through the wreckage, untouched, unbothered by the chaos around it. And then the warship spoke. A voice came from deep inside the human vessel, calm and clear, broadcast on an open channel. No encryption, no demands, just words. Quiet, but full of something sharp. It wasn't a message of peace. It wasn't a threat either. It was something else, something that made every alien in the fleet stop moving. That was the moment everything changed. The voice from the human warship echoed through every damaged ship, every cracked helmet, every frightened heart. It was soft, but strong, like someone telling a secret with a smile. Admiral Korthax couldn't look away from the flickering screen. The signal came without warning. No passwords, no codes, just permission. As if the humans didn't care who heard, as if they wanted everyone to hear. This is Captain Aaron Vale, Terran Resistant Ship Lucidity. To the survivors of the Zerth Dominion, this is not surrender. This is not mercy. This is notice. The voice paused. In that tiny gap of silence, Korthax felt a chill run down his spine. Notice? Of what? You came to take our colonies. You came to enslave our people. You burned our skies and laughed when we begged. You said we were too weak, too scattered, too primitive, and maybe we were. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It just was. Steady. Still. Like she wasn't angry anymore. Like the anger had turned into something else. But now, she said, you don't get to decide what happens next. Now, we speak. Now, we choose. The message ended, and the screen went black. Korthax stood motionless, the soundless emptiness of space pressing against the walls of the ship like a ghost. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just a warning. This was the line. This was the moment the war stopped being a war and became something bigger, something darker. He remembered the reports, the early ones. Human colonies falling, civilian distress calls, entire outposts wiped clean. The Zerth had been proud of it then. Their High Council had called it cleansing the weak. They had told their people that humans were nothing but dirt under a boot, a species not meant for the stars. The Empire believed in power, and the humans, they didn't seem to have any. But something had changed. The first human counterattack had seemed like an accident. one tiny outpost managed to fight back against a much larger force. The admiral in charge had called it a statistical fluke. The second time, they said it was sabotage. The third time, they started using the word problem. But now, it wasn't just a problem. It was a collapse. He turned to one of the few officers still standing beside him. Young, burned along one side, eyes too wide. Korthax didn't ask for a report. He didn't need to. He knew what they would say. Of the 90,000 ships that entered this sector, fewer than 1,000 were still operational. And yet, the humans had started with only 900, maybe less. How? Korthax whispered, not to his crew, but to the silence itself. How did they do this? The officer beside him answered anyway. They didn't fight to win. They fought because they had nothing else. They fought because they were already dead inside. Korthax didn't respond. He remembered one of the human tactics, something so strange that their own war computers hadn't even considered it. Human pilots crashing their ships into energy cores, using broken vessels as shields, jamming communication lines with music, songs from centuries ago, not meant to confuse, but to remind of Earth, of the past, of what they were fighting for. It wasn't strategy. It was survival turned into fire. The Admiral's gaze drifted back to the tiny human ship still floating outside. It didn't fire. It didn't run. It just watched. Korthax didn't know if it had weapons left. Maybe it didn't need any. Maybe the message had been the weapon all along. He remembered the planning simulations from before the war started. Every one of them said the same thing. The humans would fall within 6 cycles. No advanced technology. No central command. Their governments were divided. Their ships were made from scrap. Their tactics were chaotic, unprofessional. But the simulations had been wrong. So very wrong. The humans hadn't needed to match the Zerth in numbers. They didn't need better weapons or fancier ships. What they had was worse than all of that. What they had was nothing to lose. Korthax rubbed his fingers together slowly, feeling the grime of blood that wasn't his. He had led thousands. He had stood on victory podiums, ordered the glassing of planets, signed the death warrants of species. But now, in this silent wreckage, he wasn't a commander. He wasn't a hero. He was something else. He was a survivor. Sir, the officer said, breaking the stillness, should we respond? Respond? Korthax echoed, his voice hoarse. With what? With words. With a message. Korthax looked at him, really looked, and saw the fear sitting behind the young one's eyes. Not fear of death. Fear of understanding. Of realizing that everything they thought was true wasn't. There's no message we can send, Korthax finally said. The humans have already said everything that matters. He didn't say what he was truly thinking. That the war wasn't just going badly. It wasn't just lost. It had never been theirs to win. From the beginning, the Zerth Empire had assumed their power was permanent, that their technology, numbers, and discipline made them unstoppable. But they had never asked one question. What happens when you push a species to the edge and they refuse to fall? That's what this ship was. That's what this message was. It wasn't a warning. It was proof. Proof that the stars could no longer watch in silence. Because now, the humans had found their voice. And it was loud, not with shouting, not with rage, but with something far worse: certainty. The battle hadn't started with explosions. It began with silence. The Zerth fleet had arrived just after dawn, cycle over the planet Quaros 6, the largest of the Terran colony worlds in this region. Korthax remembered it clearly, because he had watched the sunrise from orbit. The planet was covered in pale clouds, seas of silver and blue, and small bright cities that looked like beads of glass from so high above. It was beautiful, calm, unarmed. His commanders had laughed when they saw the first scans. The humans had placed only light orbital defenses, a few satellites, some scrambler turrets, and a scattering of patrol vessels. A child's shield, they said. The Empire had sent 30,000 ships to break it. More than enough, the admiral said. It would be over in hours. But it wasn't. The first human ships arrived 6 minutes after the Zerth bombardment began. They came from different directions, some from moons, some from deep space, others hiding inside cargo hulls floating like debris. They didn't follow any known formation. They didn't identify themselves. They didn't warn or speak. They just moved, fast, unpredictable, and straight into the storm. Korthax had watched from the command bridge as they twisted through his fleet, ignoring larger targets and slicing into the soft spots: communications arrays, fuel lines, AI cores. It was like they could see where the pain would be worst. One Zerth cruiser, the Valor's Crown, tried to stop a cluster of human fighters by launching a full barrage of plasma missiles. But before the missiles hit, the humans split apart, literally. Their ships opened like puzzle boxes, smaller crafts ejecting and flying between the missiles, dodging fire in ways no machine should have been able to. One of them dove straight into the belly of the cruiser, detonating in its heart. The ship fell silent within seconds. There was no honor, no formation, no logic. And that's why it worked. The humans didn't act like soldiers. They acted like something else entirely, like cornered animals with nothing left to protect but the ashes of their homes. They didn't care if they died. They just wanted to make sure the Zerth remembered them after. Korthax had ordered a counterstrike. He remembered shouting into the intercom, "Block the flanks, box them in." But the enemy didn't have flanks. They didn't move in straight lines. They didn't obey the invisible rules that the Empire had followed for centuries. Where the Zerth aimed for control, the humans spread chaos like a disease. Within an hour, 24 cruisers had gone dark, not because they were destroyed, but because their own systems had been hacked. One by one, ship AIs began reciting strange Earth poetry over the loudspeakers, not in anger, but softly, like a bedtime story. Some crews panicked. Others tore out their consoles in confusion. The Zerth fleet was technologically superior, but their minds weren't ready for this kind of war. Korthax's flagship, the Immortal Edge, had been coordinating the defense. His bridge crew, veterans of 3 campaigns, struggled to make sense of what they were seeing. He remembered his top tactician saying, "They're burning their own ships to jam our sensors. That's not a strategy. That's suicide." And yet, it worked. A human vessel had rammed a Zerth supply frigate mid-jump, causing an energy backlash that knocked out 20 ships around it. Another, heavily damaged and on fire, limped into the heart of a command cluster before ejecting its entire engine core. The blast tore through the command net like a knife through paper. But the worst moment, the one Korthax couldn't stop seeing even now, was the face. A live feed had cut through the noise in the middle of the chaos. A camera, half melted from damage, showed the bridge of a human destroyer. The commander stood with one arm hanging useless at his side, blood running down his face. Around him, his crew lay motionless, slumped over controls, their bodies quiet. He should have been terrified. He should have been calling for help. But he was smiling. Smiling. His ship was burning. Smoke poured from every corner, and his systems were seconds from failing. And still, he looked into the camera and grinned like a man watching the stars for the first time. What kind of creature smiles while dying? One of Korthax's crew had whispered. No one answered. After that, the fleet began to fall apart. Not because they had lost weapons or numbers, but because they had lost belief. The certainty, the faith in their own power. Even Korthax, standing at the heart of it all, had felt something unravel inside him. By the time the order to retreat was given, half the fleet was already destroyed. The rest were scattered, systems fried, crew in shock. Some ships drifted in silence, having shut down their engines to avoid detection. Others just surrendered, turned off their weapons, and opened their gates. Not because they were ordered to, but because they didn't know what else to do. Korthax had escaped only by chance. A damaged cruiser had picked up his escape pod as the immortal edge fell apart behind him. He didn't remember the launch. He barely remembered crawling into the pod. He just remembered the silence afterward. The silence of a man who once commanded thousands, now floating alone in space, knowing he had witnessed something that couldn't be undone. The humans had won, not with strength, but with a kind of terrifying freedom, the kind that only comes from losing everything. Now, he stood again on a crippled bridge, surrounded by ruins, with that same silence curling around him like smoke. And outside, the human warship still drifted, watching, waiting, saying nothing. But Korthax knew. This wasn't the end of a battle. It wasn't even the end of a war. It was the beginning of something far worse. Outside the cracked hull of the Zerth command cruiser, the stars remained silent. But something else had begun to speak. Korthax felt it before he heard it. A flicker in the comms array. A soft static, pulsing irregularly. Not an attack. Not even a signal jam. Something stranger. Slower. Like a whisper pressing its way through the metal veins of the ship. The engineers said it was just interference from the wreckage outside. But Korthax knew better. It was them. The humans were sending another message. This time, it didn't come as a speech from a bridge. It wasn't a shout or a warning. It came as images, flash after flash, grainy clips of destroyed colonies, Zerth war machines tearing into cities, alien scientists performing brutal tests on frightened civilians, children crying in metal cages. These weren't human videos. They were Zerth footage, stolen from internal servers and now shown back to them like a mirror they could no longer break. The feed didn't have a voiceover. No one explained what was happening, because it didn't need explanation. The silence made it worse. Korthax watched, surrounded by the last officers who hadn't abandoned post. Some stared blankly. Others turned away. One even removed his rank badge and quietly dropped it on the floor. The sound it made, just a soft metallic click, was somehow louder than anything else. They all knew these images were real. Korthax himself had signed off on half the campaigns now playing out on screen. And that's what made it so powerful, because this wasn't a threat. It was proof. Proof that the humans didn't just want revenge. They wanted the galaxy to remember, to feel what they felt, to see what they saw, to make sure that no one could pretend anymore. That was the brilliance of it, the cruelty, the strategy. The humans weren't fighting with weapons. Not now, not anymore. They were fighting with memory. And memory was contagious. Across the galaxy, from the deep ring colonies to the inner systems, hundreds of ships still loyal to the Zerth Empire received the same broadcast. At first, many ignored it. A trick, they said. Human lies. Edited propaganda. But as the images kept repeating, matching old logs, confirming real events, something shifted. The fear that had always been used by the Empire was now turning on it. A cruiser near the Telmar Belt, upon seeing the message, refused orders to regroup. A destroyer stationed at a black site research base shut down its power grid and opened its doors to an incoming human vessel. Even in Therax, the capital world, encrypted messages began to leak. Zerth scientists and officers asking if it was too late to surrender, too late to change sides. And it had all started from one warship. One ugly, slow, mismatched vessel that should have been erased in the first minute of battle. Korthax felt something he hadn't felt in decades: helplessness. He could command ships. He could give speeches. He could demand formations and plan ambushes. But he didn't know how to fight a story. He didn't know how to kill an idea. And the humans, they weren't just fighting with ships anymore. They were fighting with truth, with emotion, with the power of being the ones who were hurt first. A console blinked beside him. New signal. Another human transmission. Open channel. "Play it," Korthax said. His voice came out low, barely audible. The screen lit up with the face of Captain Aaron Vale again. But this time, it wasn't the calm, controlled look from before. She looked tired, worn. Her hair was damp from sweat, her uniform torn along the shoulder. Behind her, sparks fell from a broken ceiling, but her eyes burned. "This is for the Empire," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos behind her. Not the High Council, not the generals, the people, the ones told to follow orders, the ones lied to, the ones still afraid to ask, "Why?" She paused. Not for drama, but for breath, as if even she wasn't sure how to continue. "You were told we were savages, that we were weak, that we were split and slow and stupid. You were told that our cities were messy, our technology was old, our minds too emotional for war." She leaned forward. The camera flickered. "But you forgot something." The officers around Korthax leaned in unconsciously. Every eye in the room focused. "You forgot what happens when you corner a species that feels, that remembers, that learns not by programs, but by pain. You forgot that fear doesn't weaken us. It feeds us." Another pause. Static buzzed at the edge of the transmission. "You forgot we were watching. And now." She smiled, not kindly, but with certainty. "Now, we're speaking." The screen cut out. No threats, no weapons, just those words. "Now, we're speaking." Korthax looked around the bridge. No one said a word. No one could. He thought about the early days of the war again, when his commanders had scoffed at the humans' disorganization, their messy leadership, their use of untrained civilians in battle. They had mocked the idea that any species could fight seriously without strict hierarchy. But now it made sense. The humans weren't messy. They were many, each one scarred, each one stubborn, and each one carrying a piece of the fire. The Empire had thought fear was a weapon that only they could use. They were wrong. And now, the humans were using it like a hammer. Korthax turned away from the screen and walked to the observation window. Outside, the stars burned as they always had. But he realized, in that moment, they no longer felt safe. Not because the humans had reached them, but because the stars were listening now. And when the humans spoke, the stars did not look away. Korthax stood in silence, watching the void. He used to find comfort in space. The way it stretched forever in every direction had always made the Empire feel eternal, unchallenged, unshaken. But now, the blackness didn't feel safe. It felt empty, like the stars themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Behind him, the bridge crew whispered. Some still tried to look busy, tapping consoles, repairing systems, issuing quiet repair orders. But they weren't working to rebuild. They were stalling. The transmission from the human commander, Captain Aaron Vale, had done more than humiliate them. It had done more than threaten them. It had unmade something deep inside the hearts of the Zerth. Pride had been shattered. Loyalty had cracked. And something darker was growing in the silence that followed. Doubt. Korthax turned slowly, his voice low but sharp. Status on the other fleets? The young officer at comms swallowed. The Ether Line Armada is gone, sir. Last report said they were retreating toward the Crimson Belt, but we've received no signal for 8 hours. And the Citadel ring? Korthax asked. Another officer, older this time, shook his head. Most ships have gone dark. Several captains are refusing orders. Some have switched sides. He didn't need to ask to know what that meant. Deserters, traitors, or perhaps survivors. The Empire was breaking, not from the outside, but from within. He knew the pattern now. He had seen it in other species, other cultures, other wars. When a civilization believed it was invincible for too long, it forgot how to bleed. And when it finally did, the shock was often fatal. The Zerth Empire had thought itself a mountain, but it had always been a dam. And now it was cracking. One ship at a time. One frightened officer at a time. One whispered message in the dark at a time. New transmission, someone said. Korthax blinked. From the humans? The officer shook his head. No, sir. From within. Korthax stepped forward, the deck creaking beneath his boots. The screen lit up. A face appeared. Zerth. Young. Face painted with ash. Eyes raw with desperation. To anyone still listening, he said, this is Captain Jalor of the Silver Path. We have disabled our own targeting systems. We are not turning our weapons on civilians. Not again. Static. Then more. Another face. A commander from the 4th Legion. We were told this war was about glory, but glory doesn't come with nightmares. and then more. A ship doctor, a bridge engineer, a weapons officer. One by one, they spoke. Short bursts of truth spilling into the network like water through shattered glass. They weren't surrendering. They were rejecting. Rejecting what the Empire had made them. And as their voices layered together, one after another, across hundreds of frequencies, Korthax felt something shift, not just in the ship, in him. He remembered his first campaign, decades ago. He had marched across the sands of a world called Thelos 4, crushing resistance fighters who had nothing but slings and fire. They had called him a monster. He had called it duty. He had believed in the Zerth back then. Believed they were bringing order to chaos, light to the dark. But now he saw what that light truly was. Fire, burning everything that didn't look like them. The final message came from deep within the outer rim. An image, blurry, half corrupted by dust storms and solar static. It was a human boy, maybe 12, standing in front of a wrecked city. He wasn't crying. He wasn't screaming. He just stood there, one hand holding a makeshift sign made of shattered armor. The sign read, "We remember everything." The screen went dark. No music, no final statement. Just the sound of air filters struggling and hearts breaking. Korthax stepped back from the console. He looked at the crew. No one met his eyes. Not because they hated him, not because they blamed him, but because now they understood. The Admiral's voice, when it came, was not a roar, not a command. It was a whisper. "We're done." The crew didn't cheer. They didn't salute. They just stopped. Stopped pretending they hadn't lost. Stopped pretending the Empire still held the stars. Outside, the human warship slowly turned and drifted away, leaving the ruined fleet in silence. It didn't fire. It didn't chase. It didn't need to. Its message had already landed, not on planets, not on command posts, but inside people. And people were the only thing that could truly destroy an empire. 6 weeks later, the High Council fell. Not in a great battle, not with fire and bombs, but with silence. Worlds stopped answering their calls. Governors refused to report in. Broadcast towers were overrun not by soldiers, but by their own citizens. And the stars, once mapped and owned by the Zerth Empire, now belonged to no one. And yet, they weren't empty. Human colonies began reaching out. Not with threats, but with rebuilding kits, water systems, medical drops, education terminals, and stories. Stories of resistance, of survival, of Captain Aaron Vale, who had faced 1,000 ships with a single voice, of Admiral Korthax, who had walked away from the war not in shame, but in truth. The Empire did not collapse in fire. It collapsed under the weight of knowing that what it feared most was not power, but the moment it would be seen. And it had been. By the stars, by the humans, by everyone.